A month ago in Chicago, a 30-year-old Kenyan marathoner called Ruth Chepngetich broke the world marathon record. Her breaking of the record has created quite the fuss. Here we find out why. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. The Chicago Marathon is clearly Kenyan athlete Ruth Chepngetich's happy place. She won the women's event at the Chicago Marathon in 2021 in a time of 2 hours, 22 minutes and 31 seconds. A year later, she again won the women's title in Chicago in a time of 2 hours, 14 minutes and 18 seconds, a massive improvement. The following year, so in 2023 in other words, and Chepngetich was unable to rack up her hat trick, the winner of the event being Sifan Hassan of the Netherlands. But a month ago, Chepngetich was back on the Chicago podium to wide, even hysterical acclaim. Not only was she the first woman athlete to complete the course, but she did so in a world record time of 2 hours, 9 minutes and 56 seconds for the marathon, dipping below the vaunted 2 hours, 10-minute barrier by 4 seconds. Some have gone so far as to liken her achievement to Neil Armstrong's moonwalk in 1969. Chepngetich's record in Chicago was notable for how much of a record it was. The previous record for the women's marathon was 2:11:53, set by Ethiopia's Tigst Assefa, so Chepngetich's Chicago run was fractionally under 2 minutes faster. World records tend to be incremental improvements, a dogged chipping away at solid blocks of time. But here was something completely different. A 2-minute improvement caused fans, the cognoscenti, and even the mildly curious recreational jogger to raise eyebrows. After that, they ran around the block and raised those eyebrows just a little bit more. In the days and weeks that followed, the debate about the legitimacy of the win and the record ratcheted up considerably, with much speculation as to whether this was a clean or a drug-assisted record. Amby Burfoot, the former editor-in-chief of Runner's World and a man who knows his blister from his bunion, approached the matter as follows. Quote, "We don't have proof," Burfoot growled like an Old Testament Longbeard, "but we know what we know." Without saying what he was saying, Burfoot was saying exactly what we knew he was saying, that the 30-year-old Kenyan athlete was doping, and there was no other explanation for Chepngetich's Chicago win. It was just too off the charts to be plausible. He didn't trust it, and, by extension, neither should we. For all of Burfoot's ambiguously phrased certainties, others demurred. They said that Chepngetich was not only running in Nike's Alpha Fly 3 super shoes in which she hadn't run before and have substantial known benefits, but that she was also running with 2 male pacemakers. Both were of considerable help. She was familiar with the course, having won 2 previous Chicago marathons, and she was now in the form of her life. She was hydrated during her run with a new, easy-to-digest Swedish carbohydrate drink of known benefit. It was a fast, flat, familiar course run in gentle autumn weather. Such moments only come together 2 or 3 times in any athletics career, and it all added up to a perfect day. Why be a hater? What was all the fuss? Anyway, they pointed out, the record awaits ratification. It was premature to get too hot and bothered until ratification from World Athletics took place, which should be any day now. Then again, maybe the popular pushback about the marathon record has achieved something. Maybe Chepngetich's record won't be ratified after all. The give and take across time zones, states, and continents has only intensified the moment. This has led to what some have called a tipping point for a sport with an increasingly long tradition of doping. This dubious tradition is only being addressed in a piecemeal way, say detractors, and never as an organic collective threat to the very integrity of the sport, which is what it surely is. Those who suspect the legitimacy of the record say that there's an undeniable hubris, some mention the word untouchability, in the record being broken by the margin that it was. It was, they say, just so brazen that it suggests that the athlete herself just doesn't care about the optics. She just wants that record. To this they add that the previous record, posted by Assefa, the Ethiopian athlete in Berlin, was itself a record which might legitimately be considered dubious. The famous city marathons, there are 6 of them, Chicago, New York, London, Boston, Berlin, and Tokyo, are slowly strangling the sport with speeds which are great for the marathon organizers, but are simply untrustworthy. We might now even find ourselves in a place in which it is impossible to know for sure where the dividing line between doping and non-doping marathons began, which means that athletics is slowly being divided into periods of before and after. It's getting too much, such folks say. Next we will find ourselves in the Alice in Wonderland world that is contemporary cycling, where, forgive me, the wheels of sport simply cannot allow for cleanliness. They must keep on spinning because there's too much money and too much vested commercial interest for those cycling wheels to stop. The moment of reckoning is now, although, to be fair, at the moment that moment is less a moment of reckoning than it is a moment of grassroots pushback and general hullabaloo, which could peter out on lap 3 of an increasingly long and complicated race. Those who suspect the legitimacy of Chepngetij's win in Chicago add that Kenya has a much publicized and undeniable doping problem in its athletics. Was it not Dick Pound, the head of the World Anti-Doping Agency, who nearly 10 years ago told us that it was, quote, pretty clear that there are a lot of performance-enhancing drugs being used. At the latest count, for example, according to a fine article by Alex Hutchinson in Outside, Kenya currently has 106 athletes suspended by the Athletics Integrity Unit. 2 Kenyan athletes, Monica Cheruto and Selina Jebet, were named by the unit in their September list of dopers, a not uncommon occurrence. Cheruto is ineligible from competing internationally for 4 years, Jebet for 7. The unit names Kenya as part of a cohort of 7 nations who have the highest institutional or national risk of doping. For the record, the other 6, according to the Athletics Integrity Unit, are Bahrain, Belarus, Ethiopia, Morocco, Nigeria, and the Ukraine. Where there is smoke, so the saying goes, there is fire. Forgive me while I interrupt a sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com/The Luke Alfred Show. But for now, let's get back to the story. Further, detractors add, Chepngetij's agent is Federico Rosa. Depending on your view, Rosa is either a man who generously oils the wheels of the sport or a man who makes his more enduring contribution to the sport off the track, frequently in dark places where nobody cares to go. One of Rosa's Kenyan athletes, Rita Jeptoo, won the Chicago Marathon in 2013 in a time of 2 hours, 19 minutes and 57 seconds, a full 10 minutes slower than Chepngetij's win last month. A year later, Jeptoo again won the Chicago Marathon, but shortly after her second win, the results of a pre-2014 Chicago Marathon out-of-competition test became available. Jeptoo was found to have received an EPO injection from, quote, a doctor who has never been named. We also know that this doctor was neither her coach nor her manager. Who could it have been? Jeptu's win in Chicago has subsequently been scratched, and, unusually, the International Athletics Federation, or IAAF as it was, campaigned after Jeptu's initial 2-year banning for her banning to be increased to 4 due to, quote, aggravating circumstances. This was upheld, and Jeptu was prevented from competing for 4 years on the international marathon circuit. Jeptu isn't Rosa's only athlete to have been implicated in doping. At the 2016 Rio Olympics, Jemima Sumgong won marathon gold for Kenya. 3 years later, she was banned for EPO use for 8 years, a harsh sentence compounded by the fact that she falsified her medical records and lied about her whereabouts. Whichever way you look at it, Rosa stands close to contemporary Kenyan athletics in the way that Donald Trump presents himself before his rack of colorful ties. His grubby fingerprints are all over the sport in Kenya. All of this, let's remember Burfoot's quote at the beginning of our story, is, of course, highly unstable, a cobbled-together vehicle of sleek lines and an underpowered engine. It is precisely the conjectural nature of the debate about Chepngetich's marathon record that led to outbursts in Kenyan parliament demanding redress for the slights after her win in Chicago and asking for an apology. It is not difficult to see why. The Kenyan athletics community and Kenyans at large are sensitive to accusations of cheating, particularly after the airing of a German television exposé about their sport 13 years ago. To this end, the Anti-Doping Agency of Kenya, ADAK, was formed, with its base in Eldoret, close to the epicenter of athletics in the country. The agency points out that their testing has increased substantially in the last year, with 4,135 tests being done between June 2023 and July 2024. They add that they often encounter athletes who are blithely unaware of testing protocols. Their highest number of violations are, unsurprisingly therefore, so-called whereabouts violations, in which they are simply unable to find an athlete, or an athlete does not present him or herself at a venue at a prearranged time in order to give a urine sample. Cheating in sport is wrong, particularly if it involves the use of prohibited substances, but we should also bear in mind that there is an ecosystem of cheating. Other than the fixers and the factotums, this often involves dodgy doctors and agents, frequently of European descent. They have ingratiated themselves into Kenyan athletics, but who seldom, if ever, appear to be held responsible. Athletes are naturally trusting, concerned mainly with their careers to the exclusion of almost all else. Why shouldn't they accept at face value what they are injected with or prescribed? They often don't have the emotional wherewithal to demand to know what those around them are doing, particularly if they are young and innocent. The relationship between a coach and an athlete is almost like a marriage. It is prudent not to look at it and expect to reach definitive conclusions. Kenyans do not deny they have a doping problem in athletics, but they are sensitive about being branded serial cheats, as though race somehow accounts for what many might see as their propensity to seek competitive advantage. Social and economic factors more likely play a huge part in Kenyan athletes' desperate desire to perform well and earn money on the international stage. They are Africans who come from a poor country which is part of a poor continent, and doing well in one of the world's big 6 marathons has immense financial, social, and even Faustian appeal. It has been interesting for me as a South African to read some of the mainly American diatribes against Chippengetich. All share an aversion to even coming close to understanding why Kenyans do what they do, preferring to take refuge in timeless notions of African childishness, duplicity, and lack of moral scruples. As we say in South Africa, ach, shame. Might I suggest as a narrative counterweight an argument that at least details economic desperation, a frightening world of pushy sponsors and kit suppliers. Oh, and let's not forget important people back home, frequently in the Kenyan government and sporting fraternity, who also need to be kept happy for the power they wield and the retribution they threaten. Neither is it entirely accurate to say that those around the athletes, the agents, managers, and entire system of institutional support always scuttle away to load another syringe full of EPO. Rosa, lest we forget, was brought to trial in Nairobi in mid-2016 on 6 counts of providing dope to athletes in his stable. After being remanded in custody and his passport confiscated, Rosa was released on bail. 5 months later, the 6 charges against him were miraculously withdrawn. While DAC is going about its sterling work, earnestly trying to ascertain the whereabouts of the whereabouts violators, clearly there are other institutions and influences in Kenyan society at large that prefer to have Rosa doing his sterling bit from within. This, perhaps, takes us to the very marrow of the doping matter. It is too hydra-headed to know where to begin a challenge. Too many corporates. Do Nike really want to be associated with a doper of Chippengetich's standing, or Bank of America to be associated with sponsoring the Chicago Marathon? Too many institutions, and too many institutions in the global marketplace are involved with international athletics. It is difficult to know where to go to root out the problem. Banning athletes clearly isn't working, because in Kenya there's a well-grooved production line of immensely talented runners. What needs to change is the culture of the sport. But how do you change an international culture and a global industry involving billions of dollars? The pragmatic answer, involving many thousands of athletics diehards, not to mention innumerable browsers, is to simply shrug. After your shrug, you adopt the time-honored technique of looking the other way. One of the common threads in all of this is how vulnerable, if vulnerable is the correct word, the big city marathons are to being won by dopers, although if past behavior is anything to go by, the cities themselves seem to take it all in their lengthening stride. Take Lawrence Chirono's winning of the 2019 Boston and Chicago marathons, for example. Chirono's banning, to be fair, took place after those 2 wins, in mid-2022 to be precise, and it wasn't until 2 years later that sanctions were handed down by the Athletics Integrity Unit. These included a 4-year banning for the use of trimetazidine, what is called a metabolic modulator and performance enhancer, combined with another 4-year ban for being obstructive and tampering with the rules. The combined 8 years was later reduced to a banning of 7 years because of Chirono's admission of guilt and acceptance of the sanction. Chirono was 36 when the ban was handed out. He will be 43 when he is free to run in internationally sanctioned competition once again. There is a kind of gallows humor in all of this, what we might facetiously dub a starting blocks or super shoes humor. I've read through the Athletics Integrity Unit's PDF on the Chirono matter, and from the initial out-of-competition urine test in Kaptagat, Kenya in May 2022, to Chirono's consultation with a doctor called only Joshua, the case reads like a B-grade whodunit in an exotic African setting. Karen Blixen with syringes, anyone? Not content to simply leave Joshua alone, given that he has no surname, and a man without a surname never looks particularly persuasive, over months of investigation, Chirono implicated his wife, his training partners, who were said to be jealous of his success, and the superintendent of a medical center. Files were falsified, alleged visiting times didn't add up, and the entire matter spiraled farcically out of control. Never let it be said that the international doping scene, sophisticated as it is, lacks for levity or silent cinema slapstick. Might it be time, though, for run-of-the-mill athletes themselves to start boycotting the big city marathons? This might be rather cutting your nose off to spite your face, given that ordinary athletes train for the city marathons for months and look forward to them sometimes for years. But hasn't it all got slightly out of hand? Aren't we nearing the stage of grassroots protest? Despite his 8-year banning, Chirono's name is still there as the winner of the 2019 Boston and Chicago marathons. He is, of course, innocent until proven otherwise, after all. But there's an element of convenience for the Boston and Chicago marathon organizers in this very argument, as they hide behind the fact that Chirono might conceivably have won their marathons in 2019 while on dope. Testing, say the cynics, is inadequate. Masking agents are rife, and the life of illegal substances which are microdosed might only be a couple of hours. Dopers are way, way ahead of the chasing anti-doping pack. Anyway, let's be real. Testing is only there to give the impression of due process, a sort of palimpsest of thoroughness. This impression is all the sponsors really want. And so the big city marathons carry on regardless, politely walking around the steaming turd on the street corner, quietly airbrushing inconvenient facts out of the picture in the manner of the famous opening scene in Milan Kundera's The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. In case we've forgotten, the book's opening scene recalls a photograph of two members of the Czech Communist Party standing on a Prague balcony. Two of those in the photo are Vladimir Klementis and Klement Gottwald, the leader of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party. 2 years later, Klementis, a learned man and once Czech foreign minister, was found guilty of, quote, national deviation and, wait for it, the deviationist sin of, quote, bourgeois nationalism. Klementis subsequently suffered the indignity of being forced to appear in an anti-Semitic show trial, was found guilty, and was hanged. The photographs of him standing with Gottwald were found by the Czechoslovak security apparatus. Where he once stood in the photograph was airbrushed out. He was never there. It never happened. A similar erasure is happening in world athletics. All the inconvenient facts are being airbrushed out of the story, leaving an anodyne narrative where we are required to celebrate but not question records suspiciously broken. It is also the erasure of seldom, if ever, looking back, because looking back is too spooky to deal with. Here is a system that only wants to look forward, to the next event, to the next iteration of a super shoe, to the next energy drink. The past isn't censored per se, but is known to be inconvenient, full of messy, complicated truths like the Chirono matter and the Chippengettish conundrum as we wait for her marathon record to be ratified. So we are encouraged to run forward, run faster, run forward, running faster still, scared that if we stop, we might be encouraged to look back. And what will we find when we look back? We will find the stories, the adventures, and the multiple truths of history rather than the increasingly narrow and frightening track of the future. If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.